Sorry, I stayed off because I really didn't want to stand in front of the video that was being played. Is this here we go. So in that video that you just saw, every one of those pictures was actually taken inside the walls of our building. And that's what's really interesting about it. It's not that that is anchoring those things to happen. It's actually all happening together in one spot. Now, Mars is, we say, North America's largest innovation hub. But what's really interesting about it is that we focus not just on innovation for the sake of innovation, but we want to focus on innovation at scale with impact. So there's a lot of conversation, we heard a bit of it earlier, about it's not about the tech. We actually believe that when you put tech in the right hands of the most innovative people who are concerned about progress, they actually do tech for good. And that's a lot of how we anchor our community. I'm going to describe Mars as it is today, not the 15-year journey that we've been on that got us to the stage that we're at today. I can talk to any of you about that later. One of the most important things about Mars is that we have curated not just a place, but a program that reaches far beyond the borders of the building that we're in. So we anchor 1,300 ventures with our place. Less than 10% of them are actually in the building. They're located in other innovation hubs, other innovation districts around Ontario and Canada, and some international ones. But it is really important that when you think about it, that we anchor this in a place where we purposefully bring them all together for various intersection points. One of the things about where we're located is being in the downtown core of Toronto is a really exciting place to be right now. There's 18,000 tech companies. It has one of the largest concentrations of AI experts in the world. If you think about some of the new deep learning algorithms, it was actually invented kind of just right next door to us by our founding partner, which is the University of Toronto. When our founder started Mars, the thing that he recognized was that Mars, much like your institutions here in Australia, and I'm also kind of klutzy, so just bear with me. If I fall, just pretend it didn't happen, and we'll all be good. One of the things that he recognized back then was that Canada was creating IP on par with the rest of the world, but we were not commercializing it. So we actually had a lot of that was going to the benefit of the economies, especially south of our borders, overseas. A lot of people were coming to Canada and taking not only our IP, but our people. And what we set out to do at Mars was to create an infrastructure that allowed us to bring the world to Canada so that we could actually take that IP that we were developing and create the businesses here to support our economy. And it's actually, I think, in the announcement you heard, we're experiencing a great moment in time, but that moment in time has been carefully created over 15 years of work. If we think of what's happening in Toronto, the fact that I think the stat was said earlier, literally we added 28,000 tech jobs last year. That's a big number for the city of Toronto in terms of what we're looking at. And that's growth jobs. So that's jobs that didn't exist in the economy pre-2017. And not only that, if you look at all the real estate development that's happening, a quarter of the growth in the real estate is being driven by people coming to Toronto, not just by our startups, by the community at large, the world at large, coming to Toronto to set up and actually participate in this community. One of the things that I didn't mention at the beginning is Mars is a not-for-profit organization that has received significant government support in a continuous manner, but with a completely private board. We also own $1 billion worth of building assets. It's a very unique model and the reason why people, and the reason why I think the government has continuously supported across parties as well as across tenures and time is the fact that we are a neutral place where all parties can gather and participate for the betterment of the community as opposed to the interest of any individual. Mars as an organization has been anchored from the beginning in what we call venture services. And so venture services is the support we talk about how we provide to those 1,300 companies we see on an annual basis. We actually provide, the definition of startups in our terminology is anywhere from just an idea all the way up to people with $50, $60 million of revenue. Because as the community has grown, we have grown with it. So the types of programs that we have offered, when we started, it was about creating companies. Now that our companies are growing and our ecosystem's maturing, we've moved our programming up to help the companies actually cut over the hurdle of the $20 to $30 million mark and start to turn into global companies that are competing at scale with the rest of the world. And that's about the split. And the fact that we have 10% of our companies in the 5 million plus revenue phase is actually quite astounding, because if you think of it, if you think of just normal, over 90% of startups fail. You think about how many startups we had to have created and encouraged and moved through the system to get to that kind of numbers. It's quite remarkable from an ecosystem at large. Inside of venture services, when we started, it was a very general, let's help tech companies, let's help science-based companies. And what we discovered about 5 years ago was that if we were really going to help companies and we really wanted to double down, we needed to provide sector-specific ecosystems for them to work in. But we also wanted those ecosystems to coexist. So if you look at this, and I talked a little bit about how we like to be tech for good, health, clean tech, and fintech, everybody kind of understands what that means, and you can understand the positive implication on the environment, on health, and on the money situation, and why we think that those are going to change the world. But then you get to enterprise. And everybody always goes, enterprise software, how exciting is that? It's a very for-profit dominated world in terms of what happens. Enterprise is a new sector for us, and that happens to be the sector that I lead. And the reason that we do it, because we believe in the future of work that you have to have sustainable enterprises from small all the way up to large enterprise where people want to work and actually where they're able to be competitive in the global marketplace. So we've actually curated with our innovators a very specific area that we work on that gets beyond, and you think of a lot of places, they focus on product and services. We all know that the world is being led by consumer startups and the social networks that are being created. What we're able to do inside the enterprise group is actually, see, I am really going to fall. Maybe I should just stand over here, and then I won't move so much. But what we try to do is really help people get beyond. And I heard earlier a little bit of talk about the digital enterprise. I think you need to stop talking about the digital enterprise and start talking about the intelligent enterprise, because the intelligent enterprise is the enterprise that uses the technology to enable the people and the fabric and the products that they service. And those are the startups that we cultivate and have put together in a very unique enterprise sector that we work in. All of the companies that we talk about against all of our sectors are really working along what we think are some of the very transformational technologies that exist. The one that's not up here is blockchain. And the reason why it's not up here is because we think it's still in the development phase. It hasn't really, especially in my sector, it hasn't really hit commercialization, except in some cryptocurrencies and some crypto kitties, I guess, when you think of it. I'm not sure if you guys know about the crypto kitties, but it was the most, in my opinion, saddest state of technology. But it's interesting to look at these because all of these technologies are ones that when you really think of what it does for human progress and that pursuit for a better world, these are the ones and these are the types of work that's happening that's really going to help us achieve that. Lots of conversation as I arrive in Australia and been talking to people about what's the role of corporates in this ecosystem. Do they belong there? Do they come and steal all your talent? Our partners, when we think of what companies need to be successful, our partners are the ones that we need to provide market access. They're the ones that are going to take them global. They're the ones that are going to help these startups actually grow in what they do. You'll see some of the names. You'll recognize some of them as companies that are global ones that you have here, and you'll also see some of them are more North American based. when we think about what we do, we've created a complementary offering, which is about what we call addressing the adoption gap. Because we, as Mars, we have our venture services side, but we also do, as our founding CEO likes to say, the hard work. The work that's about solving where there's problems that don't allow innovation to grow in the community that you're working in. And so we've developed a team that works with a lot of our corporate partners to address what we call this adoption gap. Because we can talk about innovation all we want, if we actually don't have the organizations who employ the majority of the people with a process that allows them to adopt it, a lot of these organizations are not going to be successful. We're not going to be able to reach those revenue numbers that we need. And so we actually do that by focusing on innovation community, innovation pipeline, which is access to the startups that we have. We talk about corporate transformation and market transformation. Corporate transformation is within the organization. Market transformation is when you're trying to move something broader, like the lack of capital. We have a lack of capital in our health side of our industry. We have a lack of capital in some of the impact side of the industry. And we've done quite a bit of work and a lot of projects that actually work in that front. We have a lot of partners. As I talked about, access to capital is a really important part of any innovation ecosystem. And we anchor it not just with Canadian, but with international capital. And international capital and attracting it to Canada, and think about it, we're an hour away from New York City by plane. We're like 3 hours, 4 hours from Silicon Valley. Why would somebody come to Toronto to invest in a Toronto startup when you have these much bigger communities? And that's because of the type of focus that we've been able to develop. And we really believe that when you bring these in, and our government actually made an important change in the regulations about 6 years ago to make foreign investment in Canadian startups a lot more open. And that has really been part of the fabric that has allowed that to come to Canada. The other part that we do is, and has been a vital part of Mars from the beginning, is the focus on talent. If you look at where we started, we've trained over 150,000 people in the business of entrepreneurship. That's about how to start companies. That's about how to do customer discovery. That's about literally the mechanics of doing it. In fact, we actually have some partnerships here in Australia with universities that have taken our program and actually done the basics of doing. We were doing entrepreneurship before it became, I think we started that 13 years ago, and now we see it out in the water supply. Most universities have an entrepreneurship program. So what we've done as our companies have grown is we've focused now not just on helping the innovators start companies, but helping people transition from legacy organizations and organizations where they might be a threat of disruption into working into startup organizations. It's a much different, and we heard a little bit about that earlier, it's much different to actually work in a high-growth firm than it is to work in a legacy process-driven organization. And you need to translate. You need to help people translate the language, to understand the new processes. What they probably learned at school is not the process that they're going to be going into. And so we've been providing services to help bridge that gap. And so we have a very active program to help our startups hire and attract. We help them with brand. We help them with, if you actually look at the Mars Twitter feed, we launched a video today called Life is Short, Work at a Startup. And it's really about helping to debunk the myths that it's too risky and it's too hard and they fail too often, and really redefining startups across for not just young people, but for actually the older workforce as well. Because what's interesting is our successful startups, the average age of our founders is not in their 20s. And the majority of them don't wear hoodies, right? So it actually is people like myself with 30 years working experience, people with 20 years working experience, 15, that are actually been able to develop these startups in a very deep way. So we have this talent services. And if you look at that talent programming, that's actually where our Google and EPP program that we talked about earlier fits. So it's one of the things that we are doing to help stimulate the development of talent and the different pools that you go to. We have active international visa programs where if you identify a talented programmer or somebody that has a very specific need, we can get a visa and have them working in a startup in Canada within 2 weeks. And it happens, and Mars is one of the recommending bodies, and we actually have a person that does this, and we bring significant numbers of people on a monthly basis into the country to fill these skill gaps that we have today, while we're providing services to move our existing population to be able to go into the jobs that we have. Because we know that there are many jobs in the new way of working that go unfilled because you can't find somebody that has the right skills or even knows to apply. So that's a lot of what we're working. So we work with Fathom, you heard Michael earlier, and that platform is an anchoring part underneath that helps us take some of what is needed and brings it down into our ability to create these pathways and move people into jobs that are going to have a sustainable future for them. It's interesting, this curve actually talks about the journey of Mars. I joined Mars in 2008. When I joined Mars, I was the founding practice lead, brought in to create one of these sectors that was happening. And if you look at that, we had 24 million in capital raised that year. There was 60 ventures and 3 advisors. And so since 2008, in 10 years, we now support 1,300 ventures. And we have a venture advisory team of over 100 people that are supporting them. And you know, in any private company that charges for their services, that would be wildly successful. We've done all that, and we've only grown. The entire organization is 260 people. And that's a very small number of people to support this kind of growth in terms of what we're looking at. So there's been $4.8 billion raised since 2008. And I get more excited about this number because capital, we all know that there's a lot of companies out there that raise a lot of capital and they still haven't proven the sustainable business model going forward, and they're still looking for what that means. We have $3.1 billion in revenue generated. And that, like 1.3 of that was in 2017 alone. So the curve on capital was like this. The curve on revenue now is starting to get bigger. And that's because of the work we're doing on the adoption side and really getting our ventures to customers in terms of what we're looking at. Just to give you some, I'm just going to quickly go through this because it's most of these companies are ones that won't be obvious to all of you. Interaxon is one that you might know of. It's a headset that allows you to actually do meditation, and it controls your brain waves and allows you to do a bunch of things. And it was a really interesting story because and this is one of the ones that goes through the entire journey at Mars. When they joined, it was 3 founders who were commercializing thought-controlled computing. And they did their first project that actually got them the funding to allow them to do the research that resulted in the Muse, was we got them in contact with our provincial government during the Vancouver Olympics. And they created an experiment that the government paid them for, where you could sit out in Vancouver and you could control the lights on our Parliament buildings, on Niagara Falls, or on our CN Tower, as you sat in a chair, and they had a video that showed you changing the lights in the different places. And they took the money from that experience and put that into 3 years of research, and they're now sold kind of all over North America and in going into European markets with this headset that allows you to do meditation and things that we know are badly needed in this world. Our clean tech, ecobee. Ecobee is a thermostat, and it is, it's a thermostat, and it's actually doing phenomenally well in terms of, I think it's in the, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue right now, and that founder will tell you that he started in E101. He started kind of way back then in terms of learning how to build things. Here's some of the recent ones in fintech. I'm going to point out League because if you look at Mars boards, the founder of League is Michael Serbinis, who was the founder of Kobo. Do any of you know Kobo? Which is the e-reader book in terms of what it does, and very successful. And he's on our board, and he has started a company that's actually looking at transforming employee benefits to be user-directed and employee-directed as opposed to, so quite interesting in terms of what he's been able to do. And he's located in our building. And here's some of the ones in enterprise. Interestingly, The one I'm going to talk about is actually a satellite company because we talked about it, I think, earlier. And they have a satellite that's this big. If you make that a square, that's literally how big their satellite is. And what's really interesting is they launched their first satellite. The coolest email I ever got to send was to our executive and our board saying that they had launched their first satellite into space as a payload on a Chinese rocket ship. Their second one is being launched out of a Japanese rocket ship going up. The fact that you have options for launching, and they can launch a satellite for $500,000. That is changing the fabric of how, and what they're doing is they're creating a space telco on top of that to enable enterprises to have control of data in shipping and hard-to-reach places where cell phones don't cover, and it's actually quite an interesting story. Capital is one of the things people always ask us is, what's the model with your ventures? Our ventures, the work we do with them is for free, but we do have arm's length companies that are part of Mars that actually provide some growth capital in terms of what we're doing. One of them is the Investment Accelerator Fund, and this is a funding gap at the seed stage, kind of in the heading to $1 million in revenue, and this is their portfolio stats. So if you look at what this means in an IRR for a venture firm, that means that they have about an 18% return. And that means that they're operating in the top percentiles of venture firms kind of in their success and their ability to look at new ventures that are coming in. That said, they've invested in 130 companies when we support 1,300. So we obviously need to scale more. Coming back to the building, we want to focus a little bit on what are the ecosystem and the tenants. So even though we're at a good spot right now, this has not been a smooth journey in a lot of times. We've had a lot of people who have criticized our focus on creating a much broader ecosystem view of our curated tenancy. So we do not, even though it's a prime space located right in the heart of downtown Toronto, we do not let it go to the highest bidder. In fact, we meet as an executive team on a bi-weekly basis to decide who's getting into the building and not, to move people around. And we have terms that people are in the building. And we really do curate startups, corporates, capital, and anybody that's in the ecosystem, because we believe that when you do that and you create the events and the programming that sits on top of that, the connections occur that are cross-sectoral, that are across types of work that's happening, and we've seen a lot of great things happen as a result of that. So we have a broad range of companies that are inside of our ecosystem. And it's interesting that when we first started this, corporates were coming in, and we weren't exactly getting success with how the corporates that we originally had were interacting with our ecosystem. We were calling them a little bit of innovation voyeurs or tourists. Like they were coming in, they wanted the uplift of their brand to be able to say that they were doing innovation. But what we found was they weren't actually actively engaging in the community. And engaging in the community is a combination of things. It's meeting with ventures, it's holding events, it's actually providing feedback, it's actually opening up their networks. The most valuable thing for any entrepreneur is an introduction. It's actually not $1 of capital, it's actually a valuable introduction. And that's what we've actually been able to do as the community has grown and has developed its own community. We are now able to hold them to task as to the type of engagement and select the ones, and we have had companies that have been paying us hundreds of thousands of dollars to be in our building, and we have asked them to leave. We have not renewed. That's why we have very specific renewals on tenancy, because we found that they were not a good ecosystem partner in terms of what we were looking for. Life at Mars today is, it's actually a really hard place to work. And the reason being is it's really hard to come in and just focus on your job, because there's always like 1,000 things going on that you think are really interesting that you want to attend or you want to read. And my team always calls me, they call me the chief squirrel, because I get into things and I follow the nuts right along, and then they lose me and they're like, you got to come back on what we're doing. So we We bring about 150,000 people through our building on an annual basis. We do 200 annual delegations. We actually now have put it got to the point that we just couldn't handle it because we actually don't have a group of people just to do tours. That's actually why we created that video, was so that when we say no to people, we can send them a tour that they can take on their own, because our tenants are actually saying you have to stop. So that's really kind of what we do. These are all the partners that I've talked about in terms of what we're looking at. These creative collisions between groups that wouldn't normally get there, if you knew how many emails I get from entrepreneurs or from my colleagues in enterprise or corporates about a valuable connection made, that those are the things that I think are the gem at the core of this network. We model ourselves. We obviously look at innovation hubs around the world. Mission Bay that's been built in San Francisco, it's a health one that we really think is interesting. The bridge at Cornell Tech in New York City, the Crick Institute in London, and Station F in Paris. Now, what's really interesting is Mars is in its evolutionary journey, and we are just opening up our second location. And what we really believe is we've partnered, this is one where we don't own the building, but we've partnered with a property developer, Menkes, that is building something that's going to be right next to the waterfront that we talked about with Sidewalk Labs and the stuff that's happening along the waterfront in Toronto. It's nowhere near the same waterfront that you have, but we're getting there, right? We're getting there. And what's interesting is we are bringing our brand of programming and animation on top of the building that is being created and extending it out in terms. So we're taking another 400,000 square feet in this building that we are going to actually, and then having the main floor to do the animation spot that follows like the programming that we have. So this is, like I said, I'm describing Mars as it exists today. There's a much longer journey and a lot of ups and downs along the way. The main things that I think to take away is that this has been, as our founding CEO always said, do the hard things. Even when you're going against some of the obvious trends, we've had a period of really bad press about our building, and we held fast to a curated tenancy. It was real easy to sell space to the highest bidder. We weathered a political storm and front page papers, but we actually held fast because we believed in the long-term mission, to the point that we actually divorced our developer that we had been developing with, got the government to step in and give us some bridge funding, and then we actually were able to raise private capital to pay the government back 4 years ahead of time to get out of the infrastructure and now to bring the building back into the hands because we felt it was going too far off mission. And we really believe in doing the hard things. Thank you.